So we're good to go. So I'll go ahead and just thank everyone for joining us. We have Dr. Young with us here today. Again, we've done a handful of webinars, talking about everything from feeding in the off season to feeding young horses to the performance horse and everything in between, I feel like, but there's still lots more to cover. So today we're going to be talking about competing in the summer heat. And I'll just do a quick introduction of Dr. Young. So she received her BS degree from Missouri State University in biology, minoring in animal science and chemistry, and earned her PhD degree from Texas A&M University in equine nutrition and exercise physiology. Her graduate research focused on mineral balance in resting and exercising horses and the effects of fat-added diets on sweat production and electrolyte requirements in working horses. Dr. Young was a member of the TAMU Equine Science faculty for several years during and following her tenure as a graduate student. Since leaving academia, Dr. Young has spent more than 20 years in the equine feed industry as a nutritionist, horse feed program manager, and business consultant for farmland industries, and then as a technical equine nutritionist for Purina Animal Nutrition. She has extensive experience in sales and sales training, marketing, and regulatory and labeling requirement. Oh, sorry, I totally missed the whole line there. But anyways, she has extensive experience in horse feed formulation, quality control and production, customer service and communication, sales and sales training, marketing, and regulatory and labeling requirements for equine feed. She was highly involved in every aspect of product development and launches, from ideation to formulation and production to package design and marketing, sales training, and distribution. Dr. Young currently is a consulting equine nutritionist with Kentucky Equine Research and is also providing nutritional consultations for veterinarians and horse owners. Dr. Young has been a professional training and riding instructor for more than 40 years and continues to do so in the Kansas City area. She specializes in eventing and hunter jumpers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you and we can talk a little about competing in the summer heat, because I know it's really hot down here in Texas and it's starting to crank up everywhere else. So I hope everyone finds this super helpful.
Yeah, first off, I can say just stay in air conditioning. But when we have horses, that's just not usually the option. So how do we deal with this heat that I think just about everybody is going through at the moment? Okay, so come on. We've had this before when my presentation wouldn't advance. Okay, so now off we go. So what I'm going to talk about this afternoon, I'm just going to talk a little bit about why heat is such an issue and in the horse, the heat production during exercise. We're going to talk about the horse's mechanisms to dissipate that heat that is produced with exercise. Then we're going to talk a little bit about heat stress, heat stroke, and symptoms and stages of heat stress. So when the horse is starting to show you that it's time to do something, you can recognize and then know what to do, the cooling off period for just the horse that's heat stressed, and then a little bit on treatment for heat stroke. Hopefully we won't see horses get to that point, but just in case, we'll cover that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about just the management and relief of heat stress, how things to think about as you are competing your horse, because realistically, we're not going to take months off because we can't. I'm in Kansas, and so yes, we're getting heat and humidity here. Perhaps not as drastic as Texas or Florida, but still it's uncomfortable, and there are times it's dangerous for the horse. So how do we manage that so that we can keep our horses comfortable and healthy through these periods? I'm going to talk about water for horses, making sure they're appropriate body condition, how to look at conditioning and fitness level for horses when working in the heat, and just some thoughts about hauling, because if you're competing, you're possibly hauling down the road in very hot situations. Then we're going to talk about electrolytes and electrolyte supplementation, and finally anhidrosis, which when you have a horse with anhidrosis, it can be a very serious problem. So to start, we're just going to cover the heat production in a horse. And why is this such an issue? It's not just the external temperatures, it's that every time you exercise a horse, the muscles of those exercising horses produce heat, and that heat must be dissipated. And when the horse is working, the horse's core temperature actually can increase by as much as 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit per minute, just because of the muscles generating the heat. So that heat has to be dissipated. The mechanisms for heat dissipation in horses are, and I'm sure at some point in your biology education, you've heard these terms: radiation, convection, conduction, and evaporation. Those are the ways that heat can be transferred from the body into the environment. Radiation is when the heat moves between objects without the objects actually touching. In horses, that is a minor mechanism. They very rarely, they do, you know they radiate heat because in the winter, when we ride them and they're radiating heat, it helps keep us a little bit warmer. But in the summer, when the ambient temperature is warmer, then radiation really doesn't do much for helping a horse dissipate heat. Convection is the forced movement of cool air across the surface of the warm skin to continually help push heat away from the body. And convection can be very helpful. We know that when we've got fans, perhaps in the arena where we're riding, we put fans in the horse's stall. When you're riding outside and you've got a breeze, you have some convection. So having that moving air across the skin does help dissipate some heat. Conduction is when the heat transfers directly between two objects touching each other. And that's more of a factor in dissipating heat. For instance, when the horse is being sprayed with cool or cold water, the heat is then transferred to the cold water, warms up the water, and in that way it is taken away from the horse's body. Evaporation, however, in horses is the main mechanism for heat dissipation. So evaporation, the horse sweats, and that liquid then covers the horse, the surface layer, and it actually gains, the liquid gains kinetic energy from the body heat, which allows it to evaporate or vaporize. And in that process, the heat is dispersed with the sweat evaporating. And again, this is the main method of thermoregulation in the horse. They lose a little bit of heat through respiration, but not as much as other animals. It's really the main evaporation, the sweating is the main method of losing heat. The issue is when the horse is overheated and they sweat a great deal, that extreme sweat loss can lead to dehydration. And with dehydration, if that continues, we go into a host of other problems. When the horse is stressed in hot, humid conditions, so that, for instance, it's sweating and the sweat, it's so hot, especially if it's very humid, the horses are sweating a lot, but the sweat really doesn't evaporate and the heat loss mechanisms really become ineffective. So if the ambient temperature is the same as the horse's body temperature, which is usually around 100 degrees, then dissipation of body heat is compromised. And remember, as the horse is working and the muscles are producing heat, that the core body temperature can increase. Remember that 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit per minute. They're not dissipating that heat, releasing that heat and getting it away. The core body temperature increases. And if it increases 5 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit, which are exceeding 107 degrees Fahrenheit for the body core, then changes occur in the body just naturally in an attempt to thermoregulate. Blood flow to the skin is maximized to help try to dissipate that heat, taking the heat to the skin where hopefully it can be dissipated into the environment. And when the blood flow is directed to the skin, then we have blood flow to the intestines decreased, which can cause basically a leaky intestinal passage, and that allows bacteria in the horse's gut to enter the bloodstream. And sometimes these are pathogenic bacteria, which can be a problem. but we also see decreased blood flow to the brain. So again, blood flow to the skin maximized, decreasing blood flow to the intestines, decreasing blood flow to the brain, which causes the blood-brain barrier to break down, possibly swelling of the brain and injury to the nerves. So these are, huge physiological effects to the horse, which is basically heat stroke and can lead to the horse's death. And you also have direct damage to cells just due to exposure of the increased body core temperature. And the cells lining the blood vessels malfunction, which can lead to formation of blood clots and disseminated intravascular coagulation. So huge problems in the horse's body when the heat is allowed, or basically not allowed to disseminate and be conducted out of the horse's body. So the first thing you're going to see when the horse is overheating is just that dehydration, because they're sweating. And again, there's a huge, I'll talk about it later, but there's a huge amount of sweat loss when the horse is overheated. So with the dehydration, they're losing all this fluid from the sweat. And some signs that you're going to see for dehydration: when your horse is you're worrying about him overheating, you can conduct a skin pinch test. So you just take a pinch a fold of the skin right at the point of the shoulder and then just release it. So pinch it, release it. The skin should snap back flat in less than a second. That's normal. Now, when the horse is starting to get dehydrated, it'll take longer for the skin to flatten back out. And the more dehydrated the horse is, the longer it takes for the skin to flatten. So that's one quick test to just see if you need to quit riding and cool the horse off. Another thing you can look at is the capillary reflex test, which you kind of lift the horse's upper lip and press with your finger right on the horse's gum above the upper incisors. And of course, when you press and then let up, that skin tone will be white. The skin will be blanched. And so if it takes longer than about 2 seconds for the skin color to return to pink, then the horse is dehydrated. Some other signs you can look for: elevated body temperature. If you know your horse's normal body temperature, especially normal comfortable horse when it's in hot conditions, take that temperature so you know what's normal. And if it's elevated, then the horse is starting to show some effects of heat. If the horse has dark urine, that's definitely a sign that the horse is heat stressed. A dull expression or behavior, it's time to pay attention and cool that horse down. And finally, if your horse exhibits synchronous diaphragmatic flutter, which is commonly called thumps, or exertional rhabdomyolysis, which is the tying up, then that's a big sign that there's something going on. If you're working in hot, humid conditions, your horse is most likely heat stressed. Hopefully there's nothing else going on, but that's definitely a big signal to stop and do something to help your horse. Now, stage 2 is considered heat exhaustion. So once the horse starts to dehydrate, the control of the body temperature decreases. So at this point, the horse's body is trying to address the temperature, the internal temperature change, can't get things done. The body temperature keeps increasing. And once it gets to 104 to 108 degrees Fahrenheit, then those physiological changes that I mentioned before start to occur. So the sweating, which is the main cooling mechanism, starts failing. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the enzymes that control the chemical reactions in the horse's body, including sweating, are heat sensitive. Those enzymes actually can be basically inactivated by the increased temperature of the body. They function the best at approximately 98 to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So when you get 104 to 108 degrees Fahrenheit body temperature, the enzymes don't function, sweat glands don't function. The body just starts having physiological issues. So in this case, warning signs of heat exhaustion are reduced sweating, or does the horse quit sweating entirely? The sweat, even if the horse is still sweating, that sweat may become thicker, but when you feel on the horse, when you reach down, feel the skin stays hot to the touch, because it's just mechanisms are not working and the horse is not cooling down. If you do that skin pinch test again, if it takes more than 6 seconds for the skin to flatten back out or does not flatten, that means the horse is in stage 2 heat exhaustion. The capillary refill time, if it's greater than several seconds, then it's time to realize the horse is heat exhausted. And if the horse starts panting, because in general, horses don't pant. You'll see the nostrils flaring, but this is the body's drastic attempt to dissipate heat. So the body starts trying to exhale more heat. And so again, this is not a normal situation for a horse. If your horse is panting, take that seriously. And then finally, you get to the point where the horse goes into heat stroke. Heat stroke is actually equine heat exertional illness, and it can be a life-threatening condition. So there are 4 levels of heat stroke. Level 1, the mentation is normal, which the horse is still mentally functional, and so their attitude still seems pretty normal, but they're hot and distressed, they're sweating profusely, and the heart rate may be greater than 150 beats per minute. Level 2, at this point, the horse is starting to be irritable and uncooperative, so you're starting to see changes in their mental status. You may also see frequent random kicking and head shaking and subtle gait abnormalities, because they're starting to possibly be some neurological issues going on. Level 3, at this point, you're going to see depression and disorientation. It's going to be obvious, and there's going to be incoordination present. And then level 4, you've got the central nervous system dysfunction can lead to loss of consciousness, convulsions, coma, and death. And then, as we talked about, the basically leaky intestinal situation, you can see endotoxemia, which is bacteria and toxins in the circulation, and that manifests as bright red mucous membranes and prolonged capillary refill times. So if your horse is at this point, this is an emergency. You need to call the veterinarian, and then your initial, after you or someone immediately calls the veterinarian, what you want to do in the short term is get ice and cold water directly on the horse's body, focusing on the large blood vessels in the head and neck, the abdomen, and the large muscles, because you are trying to just cool off the horse's body as quickly as you can. Now, when you are, like, if you're cold hosing this horse, there are a couple schools of thought. Some people say frequently scrape off the water and then repeat, because the water that gets on the surface of the very, very hot horse immediately warms up. So some people say scrape off the water, but a lot of the recommendations now are just continue to apply the cold water. So if you've got a good cold water hose, or preferably, a couple hoses, you're all standing around hosing off the horse, I don't know that there's really a need to stop and scrape off the water if you're continually applying this cold water. So a rapid decrease in the body temperature is possible if you catch it early and then manage it aggressively. And again, when you've got to this point, call the vet, and the veterinary assistance is probably going to include possible sedation, administration of anti-inflammatories, and quite possibly intravenous fluids, because the horse has lost so much fluid through the sweat in the attempt to thermoregulate before it got to this point. Now, it's much more helpful then to recognize the signs of a horse that's just overheating, and getting them cooled off in time before they progress to the point of calling the veterinarian and having to take drastic measures. So just basic cooling off. First, recognize the signs of potential overheating, which we talked about with the dehydration and heat exhaustion. When you first recognize the overheating, stop riding, stop exercising the horse, get the saddle off, move the horse to shade if that's possible, keep the horse walking, because you don't want to just let the horse, stand and let those muscles immediately quit moving. Plus, in the walking, you actually are helping a little bit of airflow covering the horse, which helps dissipate some of the heat. If you've got a breeze and you've got some shade, walk the horse in the breeze and the shade, because that's going to help. Let the horse drink to fill when walking. There are some myths that have followed letting a hot horse drink, but it's okay to let the horse drink as much as it wants. I believe the issue is really if you, for instance, take a hot horse, tie it to the trailer, and then let it drink all at once, you may be increasing the risk of tying up just due to the muscles haven't had a chance to cool off and cool down. So you can let the horse drink to however much it wants to drink, but then keep them moving. So I'm sure y'all have heard the recommendation, walk, let them have a little water, walk, let them have a little water, but truly walk, let them drink as much as they want, walk some more, let them drink as much as they want. And cold water is definitely appropriate. There's another thought that the shock of cold water to the gut can cause problems, but in research that's really not been proven. So cold water actually helps the horse when it drinks the cold water. That again helps the body core to start cooling off. And then of course, splashing or spraying cold water on the horse's body helps remove some of that heat as the water warms. The water you've just sprayed on warms up. And again, you can scrape it off, or you can just keep applying cold water, because the evaporation of the water is really what's helping to cool the horse off. You want to continue monitoring your horse's temperature as you're cooling them off. Within 10 minutes, you should see approximately a 2-degree drop in temperature. And once the horse's temperature is dropped to 101 or lower, then you can stop using the cold water and the respiration should be approaching normal. But if the horse is not normal within an hour, then again, call the veterinarian. You may be dealing with a more serious situation. So how to manage heat so that you don't get the horse into these large problems with overheating, heat exhaustion, heat stroke. Well, if possible, work your horse when the temperature and humidity are most appropriate. I know when you're showing there, you don't have a whole lot of control over that, but hopefully in the worst situations of heat and humidity, the horse show is going to have the performance events like after sunset or early in the morning when the heat is not quite as intense. One of the things that is commonly used as a predictor of how likely the horse is to develop heat stress is just simply taking the ambient temperature in degrees Fahrenheit and add that to the relative humidity in percent, and then look at that total. So when temperature plus humidity is less than 130, then heat loss should not be a problem. The horse should be able to dissipate the heat without any abnormal issues. However, when temperature plus humidity is greater than 150, that's when you need to start being aware. The heat loss could possibly be severely compromised, especially if the humidity is greater than 50% of the total. Now, I realize here in Kansas, I give riding lessons, and I was out giving a lesson at 9 a.m. the other morning, and I looked at the temperature plus humidity, and it was over 150. So that doesn't mean you have to put the horse up. That means you have to use your judgment. And in my lessons, we actually just did a lot of walking and trotting and not a lot of cantering. And if you are not competing, but you're just working your horse, you can get a lot done at the lower levels of speed and in your training and your practicing. Again, if you're at a show, realize if you've got to run your horse and you're greater than 150, be aware that you probably don't want to warm up as hard because the horse is going to be trying to dissipate heat during the warm-up period. So do everything you can, maybe stand your horse in front of fans. At a lot of competitions, when the heat and humidity get high enough, there may be misters around. So you can stand your horse or ride your horse through misters, and it's great for tack. But if it can help your horse not become heat stressed, that is all good, because the cool mist, number one, you've got the cool that is reducing the heat. And then again, you're helping with the adding water and increasing evaporation. Now, if temperature and plus humidity is greater than 170 to 180, then no matter what, very little heat loss is going to occur. And some experts just recommend not working or competing horses at all. So that's really a judgment call. Whatever you can do in those situations, if you are competing and you just don't have any choice, again, be aware, do everything you can to minimize that horse's heat stress so that you don't run into these physically compromising positions for your horse. So the big thing is just be aware of your environment. Fans, airflow help increase the loss of heat through convection because that increased air movement around the horse. Shade can help with reducing radiation from the sun, just the sunlight, heating up the horse. But that also sometimes, especially in very humid conditions, it may reduce evaporation. So utilize your environment by being smart. And of course, again, as I said, when you're at a competition or when you're at home, utilize fans, possibly utilize misters. And if you're far south and you have the opportunity to ride in environmentally controlled arenas, big fans in arenas can certainly help. I don't know very many air-conditioned arenas, but they are out there, which if you're competing in an air-conditioned arena, that is very nice. I was doing a clinic years and years ago when I worked at Texas A&M, and I was working for the extension service for a while. We did horsemanship clinics for 4-H groups throughout Texas in the summer. And I remember being in, it was down on the coast, and we were in an indoor arena that had no ventilation. There weren't windows. There were 2 doors, and they were not even opposite each other. And they had a fan in each of the doors, and it was one of those hot, humid days, and it was miserable in there. And again, the decision was made, we're just going to work at the walk and the jog. And I think we even had some kids working on barrel patterns, and we were jogging the barrel patterns because it was just too hot, not only for the horses, but actually for the people as well. With management of heat, we also want to think about the water intake of the horse, because again, as they work and they sweat, they're losing a lot of water. So we want to provide clean, fresh water. Water intake varies by body weight, by sweat loss, and by diet. And the sweat loss is affected by exercise, heat, and humidity. In general, a maintenance 1,100-pound horse is going to drink about 4 to 9 gallons per day of water, but an exercised horse can up that to more than 20 gallons per day. So it's important to make sure that your horse gets adequate water intake. And of course, remember that drinking cool water can help lower the horse's body temperature. When you're traveling and competing, it's important to encourage water consumption. You may need to carry water from home. That's often the best option if you have a picky drinker, so that their water doesn't change and they don't go to a competition and quit drinking. But if you can't, sometimes if you get them used to some masking agent in the water at home, And then when you go to the competition and they're drinking unfamiliar water, you can use that same flavoring, or some electrolytes have some flavor in there, just something so that it masks the unfamiliar taste of the water. And hopefully they will then, they will drink freely when they're traveling. And of course, offering water when hauling is very helpful, especially in the summer when you're traveling in the heat. Body condition is something that people don't always think about when they're dealing with heat stress in horses, but it is important to make sure your horse maintains appropriate body condition, because excess weight first increases the workload and creates more heat production. And secondly, that external body fat is a great insulator, and it makes it harder for the body to dissipate that heat. So again, it's important. I think every presentation I do at some point, I mention body condition scoring, but it's really important for horse owners to be familiar with that system, so you know whether your horse is too fat, too thin, or just right. And in general, we want, for the competing horses, we want them to be right about a body condition score of 5, so that they have enough fuel to gas their exercise, to power their exercise, but they don't have a big fat outer covering that works as an insulation and adds extra weight. Now, not body condition score, but just conditioning your horse. So addressing your horse's fitness level. You need to look at your horse, ride your horse, and understand what your horse's fitness level is, because horses in regular work that are fit and well conditioned can adjust more easily to rising temperatures. If the horse is lacking fitness, overweight, or possibly underweight, they're most likely going to have more difficulty dealing with the increased stress associated with the heat. So when you're going into hot seasons and planning to continue exercising, continue showing, competing, when you start out that season, make sure you slowly build up the fitness level and the stamina before and as the heat and humidity increase. So at this point, as I'm talking to you in June, if your horse is not fit right now for competition, take some time and gradually build up that fitness and conditioning before you really start working your horse hard. And the other thing that goes along with this is the conditioning to the heat and humidity. You want the horse's body to gradually have a chance to build up its heat dissipation mechanisms. Another thing to think about when you're competing in the heat of the summer is hauling. I don't know how many people actually get in their horse trailers and have somebody else pull them down the road, but it is amazing. In some of these trailers, the lack of ventilation can be really detrimental to the horse in the summer. There was a research study on ventilation in trailers, and they took, I'm not sure how many trailers they used, but they had all the windows open, they had all the vents open, and even with that, the windows and vents completely open, hauling down the road at the highest speed, which I'm going to assume is the speed limit, the exchange rates, air exchange rates, were only half of what is recommended for stabled horses. And with slant load trailers, stall 1, which is the stall that is nearest to the front of the trailer, had the least air exchange. So the horses that were in the first stall were always the sweatiest, the hottest horses. So recommendations, number 1, first, open everything. If you've already got your trailer, open everything when you're hauling down the road. I've actually seen some little articles with using PVC pipe to kind of build a little wind funnel going into the trailer. So as you go down the road, it's kind of capturing wind and blowing more air on the horses, which to me, this is not a bad deal. But the biggest windows you can have, if you're ordering a trailer, buying a trailer, look for big windows. Open or remove the upper rear doors. If you've got those aprons on the back, like you've got a ramp and aprons, open the aprons, remove them, because that actually does make a significant difference in ventilation in the horse trailer. And if you've not bought your trailer, when you do, look for maximum ventilation before purchase. Now, moving into electrolytes. It's very, very important to think about electrolytes when you're working your horse in the heat of the summer. Electrolyte requirements increase with work and sweat loss. For horses at maintenance, then free choice salt may be adequate for meeting their sodium, potassium, chloride, and magnesium needs, or even just at light work. But moderate to heavy work and or excessive sweating requires electrolyte supplementation. In hot, humid climates, even if you're not working your horse, be aware of this, because if your horse is standing out during the day and sweating profusely, they need electrolyte supplementation. The thing with horse sweat and human sweat are pretty different. I get into equine sweat because my PhD work was on horse sweat. So I'm really familiar with horse sweat. The first thing to know about horse sweat versus human sweat is horse sweat is more concentrated in electrolytes than human sweat. In humans, our blood electrolyte concentration is actually higher than in sweat. In horses, it's not. The horse sweat is more concentrated in electrolytes than their blood is. The other thing with humans is as humans work more and sweat more, the sweat becomes more dilute. So there's less electrolytes in the sweat. And with acclimatation to heat, again, the sweat becomes more dilute. But that's not really seen in horses. So the sweat starts out more concentrated in electrolytes, and it pretty much stays concentrated throughout the sweating bout. So horses lose a tremendous amount of electrolytes, and since sweat is their primary means of heat dissipation, they lose a whole lot of sweat when they're working. So as I said, primary route of heat dissipation, 65 to 70% of that heat produced by work is dissipated, or just the heat produced by the horse standing in hot, humid conditions. 65 to 70% of their body heat is removed through sweat loss. For a routine racehorse workout, research has shown that they can lose 1 to 2 gallons of sweat. And during a normal endurance ride, a horse can lose 6 gallons of sweat. And an exhausted, dehydrated endurance horse can lose 10 gallons of sweat. Sweat loss is often measured by the horse's body weight loss during exercise. And in my research, that is what we did. And I exercised, in my research, I exercised first miniature horses and then thoroughbred racehorses. I exercised them enough to actually double their energy requirements, which is considered a heavy exercise, which in the race horses, that meant we hand galloped those horses 30 minutes, and it was about 6 miles. And those horses lost up to 20 pounds of sweat. So that's really not even a maximal workload that some of these horses are subjected to. And that is a lot of sweat and a lot of electrolytes. So again, sweat is high in electrolyte concentration, does not become dilute, and in humans and some other animals, there are good compensatory mechanisms. As I mentioned, the sweat becomes more dilute over time and with conditioning and compensation. But in horses, there are poor compensatory mechanisms for this electrolyte loss. In my research, it appeared that there are some compensatory mechanisms in the urine, When the horse is losing a lot of electrolytes in sweat, then they lose fewer electrolytes in the urine, but this is not enough to actually truly compensate for the electrolyte loss in sweat. So electrolyte supplementation is very important for these horses. Do you do daily supplementation? In general, that's going to be my recommendation, but it kind of depends on the workload and the sweat loss. If the horse is not sweating profusely every day, you possibly could get away with just salt. And you always want to start with free choice salt. And if the horse needs more, you can possibly add some salt to their daily feed or add the electrolytes to their daily feed. But you just want to look, if the horse is sweating profusely and or over a long period of time due to exercise or just environmental conditions, then daily supplementation is recommended. You may possibly only supply the electrolyte during periods of increased sweating, whether that's from work or the environment. A single dose of electrolytes, and some people will just do a single dose during competition or at a maximum workload. But single dose will cause an immediate surge in blood electrolytes, but it also stimulates increased excretion of electrolytes. So you don't really want to just do a single dose after maximal exertion. You need to have a plan for replacing those electrolytes and maintaining a good electrolyte balance in the horse. So Kentucky Equine Research has a couple different electrolyte programs. The Restore SR and Restore Paste, that is a proprietary slow release mechanism. So the nice thing with this electrolyte supplementation program is that you feed the Restore SR in the horse feed, and then you don't get a single slug of electrolytes going through the gut immediately, but you have that slow release of electrolytes, so it's continuously maintaining the balance in the horse. And then there's the paste that is also a slow release mechanism that can be used when the horse is maximally stressed and has a big bout of sweat loss. Now, horses on furosemide, that's a little bit different situation. You still, of course, want to replace the electrolytes, but you have a kind of compounded issue because furosemide is a diuretic. So it increases urinary mineral loss, which increases the water loss and minerals in the urine. So not only are you getting the sweat loss, you're getting more mineral loss through the urine. And in research on these horses on furosemide that are losing more weight due to fluid loss with exercise, when they compared horses just on the furosemide to horses not, the water intake for the horses on furosemide was not increased to help replace the water loss. And it could take up to about 3 days then for those horses on furosemide to actually regain their hydration status and their mineral status. And if you're working a horse regularly, you want quicker recovery for that. Number one, if you're competing regularly, you want quicker recovery. And then just for your horse's health, you want as quick a recovery as you can support. So you want to supplement to stimulate the water intake and also replace those specific minerals lost in the sweat and the urine. And Kentucky Equine Research actually conducted research and developed an electrolyte supplement that really is specialized for these horses on furosemide. And that is the race recovery system. And it comes in powdered form and a tube. And you can see on the slide, the recommendation is you use a tube of the race recovery electrolytes 1 to 2 hours after the race, and then the second tube several hours either later in the day or the next morning after the race. And then beginning the day after the race, you want to use the race recovery, the dry form, the powder, and you're going to use a scoop twice a day one scoop in morning and evening meal to just maintain that electrolyte status in the horse's body. Now, anhidrosis, and those of you in the South are probably more familiar with anhidrosis than the people living in the North. But if you've had a horse with anhidrosis, you know what a problem this can be. These are horses that are incapable of sweating normally. It may be that the horses quit sweating entirely, or they may have patchy sweat, or they just don't sweat enough. But in these situations, the sweat glands do not function properly. It's not completely understood yet. There does seem to be a genetic component, but we don't know at this point if that genetic component explains all situations of anhidrosis or just a specific type of anhidrosis. But if a horse is not sweating or not sweating enough, they're at a much higher risk of hyperthermia, heat stress, or heat stroke if they're exercised hard or in hot, humid conditions. Again, you may have a complete absence of sweat or inadequate sweating. Sometimes I've seen horses that they will still sweat under the saddle pad, but they're not sweating anywhere else. They're not sweating on their neck, on their shoulders, and their flanks, just under the saddle pad. And you know you've worked them hard enough that they should be sweating. When this happens, consult a veterinarian, because again, it can be a really big problem. So as I said, it appears to be a heritable condition. In research, they found a mutation that might be responsible for chronic idiopathic anhidrosis, or CIA. At this point, there's no cure and no proven treatment. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence of this or that might help. And when I'm dealing with an anhidrotic horse, as long as it's a suggestion that's not going to be harmful to the horse, you might try it, because there are some treatments that seem to be helpful for some horses. There was some research done, I think it was reported in about 2014, of a supplement that was said to reduce the anhidrosis in 90% of horses. And it's really interesting because that supplement's not even available. So I'm thinking that research was really not repeatable. Now, the typical response for an anhidrotic horse is move the horse to a cooler climate. A lot of anhidrotic horses, when you send them north, they start sweating again, and it's no longer a problem. So again, we don't really know exactly what's causing the sweat glands to malfunction. Is it that the horses are in a situation where they're sweating so profusely that the sweat glands just become overloaded and dysfunctional? Or is there something else completely going on? We just don't know. And I'm not even going to say that moving the horse to a cooler climate always helps, but for a lot of horses it does. Now, if you're living in South Central Texas and you've got a great horse, that's probably not something that you want to do. So then you do your best to manage it. You may not be able to work that horse hard when the conditions are not conducive to sweating. But when you can, you want to make sure the horse is getting plenty of cool water. The thought, and part of my research, was feeding fat to exercised horses, because burning fat as a fuel is actually cooler than burning protein or carbohydrates. There's less of a heat increment, less heat of digestion of fat versus heat of fermentation of fiber, for instance. So the thought is, if you replace some of the soluble carbs and the fibers in the diet that are used for calories, if you replace them with fat, perhaps you're reducing the heat increment enough to make a difference for these horses. And I have to say, in my research looking at the heat increment, feeding fat to the horses I worked with did not decrease sweat loss. So it's possible that changing the heat increment may have happened, but it was so subtle that when we were measuring sweat loss in pounds, The difference was too small to actually be able to measure. But the thought is there that having a fat supplemented diet may help reduce that heat increment. But if you are dealing with anhidrosis, try to avoid overheating those horses in warm climates. Allow 10 to 14 days for horses to become familiar with a warmer climate before beginning work. And some people actually recommend for an anhydrotic horse up to 3 months of acclimation before you really start stressing the horse in hot weather. Again, provide plenty of cool water and supplemental electrolytes. Ensure horses are properly cooled and rinsed after exercise. Exercise during cooler times of the day, such as early morning or sometimes in the evening after dark. And note symptoms early and manage to keep the horse comfortable. Avoid heat stress. So you notice I've got the picture of the fan for these horses. It helps to keep them under fans as much as possible. And then the picture of the sprinkler, because when I was in Texas giving riding lessons, I did have a lesson horse named Buster, and Buster was anhydrotic. And Buster was a wonderful lesson horse. And I ended up dealing with Buster by putting a sprinkler in my arena. And we'd have lessons at the cooler time of the day, but of course in South Central Texas in July, August, there's really no cool part of the day. So we would ride when it was the coolest, but then I'd set up that sprinkler, and when Buster started puffing a little bit, I would have the rider go stand in the sprinkler. Again, we cleaned a lot of tack, but it managed Buster. So whatever you can do to help manage the heat stress in the horse. Buster was not exercising strenuously. So again, if you've got a really competitive horse, sometimes the best option is to send him north and see if that, deals with the anhidrosis. So take home message. Be aware of situations that put your horse at stress for times of heat and humidity. Avoid heat stress in your horse however you can. Treat them well, manage the situations. You want to avoid dehydration, heat exhaustion, and of course, heat stroke. So adjust your work schedule, your work intensity to meet the environmental demands and stresses on your horse. Provide adequate water at all times. Ensure proper body condition score, fitness level. Allow the horse time to acclimatize to the heat and workload. Think about heat stress when you're hauling and your travel considerations. Then, of course, provide appropriate electrolytes. Free choice salt may be adequate, again, for maintenance horses or at light work, but when they're working hard or sweating profusely, make sure you supplement electrolytes as needed. And finally, recognize and manage anhidrosis in horses. So final take-home message. That we still have the 10% off KER products online for WPRA members with the code WPRA 2021. And even though it's 2022 this year, that code is good through the end of this year. So WPRA 2021. And then the KER June promotion, which is very timely. If you purchase a bucket of electrolyte powder, you can get a free tube of Restore Paste with the code summer22 on the website. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I don't know, Hannah, if we had any questions.
Yeah, so take some time and comment with some questions that you have. I'll try to catch them. Something I thought that might be really important just to reiterate if someone came in a little bit late was kind of that rule of thumb for how hot it is, when you're riding, the temperature plus percent humidity. Can you remind everyone of that real quick?
Yes, and I'm going to go back to that slide. So if anybody wants to take notes on this.
Yeah.
Okay, you take the temperature in degrees Fahrenheit and add it to humidity in percent. You can get that on your handy dandy weather app, because I do that all the time. I pull up the weather app and say, okay, it's 83 degrees, but it's 73% humidity. So 83 and 73 is 156. Yeah, so that's, and actually, as I mentioned, giving lessons, that's what it was the other morning when we were riding. So I said, okay, we're going to take it easy on the horses. Our indoor arena, while there's great shade, there's not good ventilation. So we slowed down everything and did a lot of walk trot work, put poles on the ground, did all sorts of things. But again, add temperature and humidity, less than 130, it's really nothing to worry about. 130 to 150 is something to think about. Pay attention to your horse. And, you know, if they get overheated, back things down, slow down, and give them a chance to cool off. Maybe walk, if there's a nice breeze, go take them for a little walk in the breeze. But when you're over 150 temperature plus humidity, then they're going to have a hard time, you know, dissipating their heat, especially if the humidity is greater than 50% of the total and greater than 170 to 180. That's when you really need to make a judgment call. Do I really need to be riding this horse at all? And if I do, if I have to be riding the horse, what can I do to help reduce the heat stress? When the horses are used to those temperatures and you've given them a chance to acclimate, because there are parts of the world that people are riding horses, and that predictor, that 170 to 180 is, you can't get away from it. But again, make sure the horse is acclimated, they're fit, they have access to water. If you got to spray them off and cool them down, be aware, listen to your horse, and make sure you don't push them past the point of, you know, heat stress.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that's a really great rule of thumb, and one that I haven't super, really heard before. So I think that's really great for everyone to think about when, is it too hot to ride? It looks like we might have a question from someone that does some endurance riding. So on a hot day, when you're doing that endurance riding, how often would you use electrolytes? And then what kind of dosing? I guess it really depends on what you're using, but how would you kind of treat, a long hot day while you're competing?
That is a really excellent question. And I have to admit, I'm not an expert on endurance riding and endurance racing. However, one of the other nutritionists at KER is. That is what her riding career has been. So I am going to suggest that you contact us at KER.com and just say, I've got an endurance question for Dr. Kathleen Crandall. And Kathleen is going to be able to give you a spot-on recommendation for how best to supplement your electrolytes when you are endurance riding. So we all have to know our limitations, and that's Kat. I'm a sweat and electrolyte person, but I've never participated in endurance riding, and that's a whole different field. So sorry, that is my best answer there.
Well, perfect. I mean, you told them where to go, and yeah, your website has tons of resources and you have a lot of great, knowledgeable people. So,
Absolutely.
Make sure that you all go to that website to find lots of great articles, research, things like that. One last question is, sure, when we're talking about free choice salt, if I have a salt block just in my horse's pen, is that good enough, or do we want like some table salt put in their grain? What's easiest for my horse to get and utilize?
That is another great question, because horses' salt intake, when it's free choice salt, is highly variable. And there's a thought out there that the horses will eat what they need, and no, they won't. I have 3 of my own and it's really interesting. The old guy doesn't ever lick his salt. They all have salt in their stalls. He doesn't touch it. The young guy licks a little bit, and the middle-aged guy just loves his salt, especially for him. He loves his Himalayan salt so much. I spend the money and hang a pink Himalayan salt block, although salt is salt. White salt is just fine. But for horses that are sweating and you know they're not utilizing the free choice salt, there is nothing wrong with adding a tablespoon of salt to their, just plain white salt, adding a little bit to their meal to make sure that they are getting the electrolytes. For maintenance horses and light working horses, hay is actually an excellent source of potassium. So unless they're sweating heavily, potassium is not an electrolyte that we tend to be worried about a deficiency. But sodium and chloride, typical feeds and forages don't have enough sodium particularly to meet requirements of sweating horses. And the nice thing, it's very hard to overdo electrolytes because what is not used in the body is just flushed out in the urine. So again, adding a little bit of salt to their feed when they're not free, taking advantage of their free choice salt is not a bad idea. The one time it is a bad idea is in a case where your horse just stands and eats the salt block. And that's actually called psychogenic salt consumption disorder. And in that situation, take away the free choice salt and put it in their feed so you can actually monitor and make sure they don't overdo their salt intake.
Perfect. Okay, well, I think that's all we have for now. If I missed your comment or you think of other things, like we said, go to KER.com. There's lots of great resources. You can message them on their Facebook page, tons of information there. And then if you want to go back to that last slide again, just so they know those promos that are going on.
Oops, went too far. There it is.
You can take advantage of the WPRA 10% discount, which is that WPRA 2021, and then the June promo that's going on right now. I'm sure we'll have another awesome Facebook Live coming up here in a couple months. But thank you so much for joining us. And it was great information, especially with summer hot on our heels. So
it's timely.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time.